In the late summer of 1980 in Iowa, a 25-year-old woman named Patricia Kame fell suddenly and gravely ill and died of a sickness her own doctor could not at first name. She had been healthy. She had done nothing but use a product advertised as more absorbent and more modern than anything that came before it, a product whose slogan promised that it even absorbed the worry. The company that made it was Procter Gamble of Cincinnati, Ohio. By that summer, its goods sat in nearly every home in the country, the soap in the dish, the toothpaste on the shelf, the detergent in the laundry, the paper in the kitchen. For 143 years, the company had studied the American household with more precision than any other institution on earth, learning how to place a thing inside a home and make it indispensable. 2 years later, a federal jury would be asked to decide what Procter & Gamble had known about the product that killed her and how long it had known it. To understand how a soap company arrived in that courtroom, the story has to begin in a city built on the slaughter of pigs. Chapter 1. Porkopolis. The city that would one day supply the most trusted brands in the American home did not smell of lavender or lemon. In 1837, Cincinnati, Ohio, smelled of blood and rendered fat. Set on a bend of the Ohio River, it had become the busiest slaughtering town in the United States, and the people who lived there had learned to build their fortunes on what the pig left behind. The English traveler Isabella Bird, arriving some years later, recorded her disgust at a place where swine riot through her streets. The city had a nickname, and it was not the Queen City. It was Porkopolis. The scale of that trade is difficult to picture now. In 1833, the packing houses of Cincinnati killed and processed 85,000 hogs in a single season. By 1840, 48 packing plants employed 1,200 men and turned out more than $3 million in packed pork a year. In 1845, a New Orleans newspaper marveled that 160,000 hogs had already been slaughtered in Cincinnati that year. By 1850, the city was the principal hog market in the world and the sixth largest city in the nation. And across that decade, the slaughterhouses of Cincinnati rendered a full fifth of all the lard oil produced in the United States. That last figure is the one that matters, because lard was never only food. The fat boiled out of all those animals became oil and glycerin and the cheap raw stock of two humble trades. Candle makers needed it. Soap makers needed it. And in the crowded streets around the slaughterhouses, both trades flourished on the tallow that the pork barons treated as runoff. The most domestic company in American history would be born, quite literally, from the offal of a killing floor. Into that city came two men who would never have met had they not married into the same family. William Procter was an Englishman whose woolen shop in London had been ruined by fire and burglary, leaving him deep in debt. He crossed to America, took up candle-making there, and came to rest in Cincinnati almost by accident, staying on after his first wife died in the city in 1832. James Gamble was an Irishman, carried to America as a boy in 1819 when famine hollowed out his corner of Ireland, and apprenticed to a soap maker. One man made candles, the other made soap. Both depended on the same raw material, the tallow and lye that Porkopolis produced in rivers. The two might have stayed rivals across a narrow market had it not been for their father-in-law. Procter and Gamble had each married a daughter of a Cincinnati candle maker named Alexander Norris, which made the two men brothers-in-law, and it was Norris who pointed out the obvious. His sons-in-law were competing for the same fat, the same suppliers, the same customers, in a city that already held more than a dozen other soap and candle firms. It was foolish. Together, Norris told them, they might hold what neither could hold alone. On the 31st of October, 1837, in a country sliding into the worst financial panic of the age, William Procter and James Gamble signed a formal partnership. Their combined assets came to about $7,000. Their factory was a single wooden kettle with a cast-iron bottom, set up behind a storeroom at the corner of Main and 6th Streets. Procter kept the books and minded the store. Gamble stood over the kettle and made the goods. There was nothing in the arrangement to suggest that anything remarkable had begun. Two tradesmen had pooled their savings in a ruined economy, in a city that reeked of the slaughterhouse, to sell soap and candles to their neighbors. But the river that carried the stench also carried the goods. The Ohio ran west and south toward the Mississippi and the raw new towns of the interior, and Procter and Gamble loaded their soap and candles onto flatboats bound downstream. Their crates traveled farther than the two men ever would, into places where no one had heard the names Procter or Gamble, stacked among the cargo of 100 other shippers on crowded wharves. To tell one shipment from another, the dock hands began to scratch a small mark onto the company's crates. It was a crude thing at first, a cross, and then a star. In time, the firm would take it up as its own and stamp it on everything it made until the little emblem carried more weight than the signatures of the two men who owned it. And those men could not have known that a century later, millions of Americans would look at that same small symbol and see the signature of the devil. Chapter 2. The Mark. The mark began as a matter of convenience. In the years around 1850, the men who loaded Procter and Gamble's crates onto the riverboats needed a fast way to tell one company's candles from another's, and so someone scratched a rough star onto the star brand boxes, and then a crescent beside it, a simple man in the moon looking out across a scatter of stars. It was the kind of decorative figure that turned up everywhere in that century, on clock faces and quilt squares and painted shop signs, a familiar and comfortable thing. No one recorded who first drew it, and no one thought it mattered. But it came to matter a great deal because of a fact that is easy to forget now. In the middle of the 19th century, a large share of the people buying soap and candles could not read. A printed brand name meant nothing to a customer who could not sound it out. A picture could be recognized by anyone. The moon and its 13 stars, one star for each of the first American colonies, became the way an entire country of buyers knew that a bar of soap had come from Cincinnati and could be trusted. Before Procter & Gamble had a single famous product, it had a face. It simply was not the face of either man who owned it. The company learned the value of that face the way companies usually learn such things, by nearly losing it. In 1875, a soap maker in Chicago began stamping an almost identical moon and stars onto its own boxes, trading on a reputation it had not built. Procter & Gamble took the matter to court, and Procter & Gamble won. 7 years later, in 1882, the company registered the emblem formally with the United States Patent Office, staking a legal claim to the little drawing that its own dock hands had improvised a generation earlier. The firm had understood something most of its rivals had not. The symbol was not decoration, it was property, and property was worth defending. Over the following decades, the moon and stars was tidied and refined, its lines cleaned for the printing press, until in 1930 a Cincinnati sculptor named Ernest Bruce Haswell gave it the form it would carry for most of the 20th century. The bearded man in the crescent, his hair curling to fine points, gazing across the 13 stars. It had become one of the most widely reproduced images in American commerce, stamped on tens of millions of packages, printed on the company's letterhead, mounted above the factory gates. To the people who bought the company's goods, the emblem meant cleanliness and reliability. It meant home, which is the quiet, unsettling thing about it, seen from a distance of a century and a half. The same curling beard and scattered stars that a sculptor had shaped to signify trust would, before Haswell's own century was out, be searched by frightened Americans for hidden sixes and the horns of a goat, denounced from church pulpits and offered as proof that the makers of the nation's soap were servants of the devil. That reckoning was still decades away. In 1882, the moon and stars meant only what the company intended it to mean, and what it meant was money. And yet a trusted symbol could carry a regional firm only so far. On the eve of the Civil War, Procter Gamble was one solid Cincinnati business among many, prosperous and local, its crates drifting down a single river to a scattering of towns. What lifted that comfortable local company into a national power was not the mark, and not the two men, and not any product they had yet thought to make. It was the war. In 1861, the country began to tear itself apart, and the armies marching off to kill one another would need, before almost anything else, soap and candles by the ton. Chapter 3. The War That Made Them. The men who ran Procter & Gamble had seen the war coming before the guns did. The soap they sold and the candles they poured both depended on rosin, the hardened sap of the southern pine, and nearly all of it came up the rivers from the forests of the Confederacy that was about to exist. A soap company in Cincinnati was, in a sense, a hostage to the South, and so in 1860, with the country still nominally whole, the founders sent their sons down to buy their way out of the trap. James Norris Gamble and William Alexander Procter, both still young men, traveled to New Orleans and bought all the rosin they could carry north, securing a great supply at $1 a barrel. By the standards of what was coming, it was almost nothing. Within a year, that same rosin would be worth many times the price, and unavailable at any price to the firms that had not thought ahead. When the war came, it came as ruin for most and as fortune for a prepared few. Competitors who depended on Southern rosin cut their production or closed their doors. Procter & Gamble, sitting on its stockpile, did the opposite. The Union Army needed soap and candles in quantities no peacetime market had ever demanded, and the government turned to the Cincinnati firm that still had the raw materials to make them. The contracts that followed were the making of the company. The numbers give the shape of it. 22 years after two tradesmen had pooled $7,000, the firm's sales had already passed $1 million a year, worked out of a factory of some 80 employees. Then the war multiplied everything. The rosin the cousins had bought at $1 a barrel became the scarce foundation of an army's hygiene. According to the record kept by the Ohio History Connection, the Union Army required 1,000 cases of Procter & Gamble soap shipped to its encampments every day, work that drove the company to take on 300 more hands, many of them laboring through the night. And when Confederate troops came within a few miles of Cincinnati and martial law shuttered every business in the city, a single exception was made for the soap works that the Army could not do without. There was a second fortune inside the first, and it was worth more than the contracts. On every crate that went out to the camps, the company stamped its moon and stars. Hundreds of thousands of young men from farms and towns in every corner of the Union spent the war washing with Procter & Gamble soap and reading by Procter & Gamble candlelight, under that little emblem until the mark came to mean to them what any familiar thing means to a frightened man far from home. When the war ended and the survivors went back to Ohio and Maine and Illinois and Wisconsin, a great many of them carried the habit with them and asked for the same soap by its sign. A Cincinnati company that had once shipped down a single river was suddenly known in half the households of the North. It had taken a national catastrophe to make a national brand. The moral arithmetic of this was never complicated, and the company did not pretend otherwise in its own histories, which tell the rosin story with pride to this day. The war that killed some 600,000 Americans was, for the makers of the moon and stars, the single greatest stroke of fortune in their history. Foresight and slaughter had arrived together, and it was not always easy to say where the one ended and the other began. Procter Gamble came out of the Civil War richer, larger, and more widely known than the two aging founders could have imagined when they signed their names in the panic year of 1837. But an army is a customer that goes home. The contracts ended with the war, the soldiers dispersed, and the company faced in peacetime the problem that faces every supplier of a booming wartime good. It had to find something to sell and someone to sell it to, once the shooting stopped. The answer, when it came, would not be a government contract. It would be a single bar of ordinary white soap, mixed a little too long in a Cincinnati vat, that floated. Chapter 4. Ivory. The story the company told for the next 100 years was a story about an accident. A workman at the Cincinnati factory, it was said, went to lunch and left a soap crutcher running, and the machine beat so much air into the batch that the finished bars were light enough to float. When the mistake was discovered, the reasoning went, nothing had been added and nothing had spoiled, so the batch was poured and cut and sold, and before long customers were writing in to ask for more of the soap that would not sink. It was a charming story, and Procter & Gamble repeated it for generations. It was also, in the ways that mattered, untrue. The floating soap was no accident. James Norris Gamble, the founder's son and the company's chemist, had worked out how to whip air into soap years earlier, as early as 1863, and had noted in his own hand that the firm might make all its stock that way. The idea was shelved, and then, in 1879, deliberately revived. When ivory reached the market, it was engineered to float, and the tale of the careless workman was, at best, a decoration. This is worth pausing on because it is the first small instance of a habit the company would one day raise to an art. The truth was that a chemist had solved a problem. The story that sold was that Providence had dropped a gift into a soap kettle. The company chose the story. The name came from Scripture. Harley Procter, the other founder's son and the firm's advertising man, was sitting in church one Sunday when the minister read from the 45th Psalm, a verse about garments that smelled of myrrh and aloes brought out of the ivory palaces. The word caught him. Ivory was white and clean and rich, and it carried the weight of something ancient and pure. He gave the new white soap that name, and with it a set of associations that had nothing to do with tallow or lye, and everything to do with how a buyer would feel reaching for the bar. Then Harley Procter did the thing that made him, more than any single product, the true inventor of the modern brand. He decided to prove the soap was pure and then to sell the proof. He sent samples to chemistry professors and independent laboratories to be measured against the Castile soaps that were the standard of quality at the time. One chemist returned an analysis in a neat table, the soap broken down by percentage into its parts. Procter added up everything in the column that was not, strictly speaking, soap, a little uncombined alkali, a trace of carbonates, a remainder of mineral matter, and found the total came to 56/100%. He subtracted the figure from 100, and in December of 1882 the country met a phrase it would still recognize a century and a half later. Ivory soap was 99 and 44/100% pure. It was a masterpiece, and what made it a masterpiece was that it meant almost nothing. There was no agreed standard for the purity of soap, no authority that had ruled on what counted as pure and what did not. Ivory was pure of the particular impurities that one paid chemist had happened to measure, and nothing more. But the number did not sound like an opinion. It sounded like a fact, exact to the hundredth, the kind of figure a scientist would sign his name beneath. And that was the whole of its power. Harley Procter had grasped, decades ahead of his rivals, that a customer does not really buy soap. A customer buys the belief that the soap is good, and belief, he understood, could be manufactured as surely as the soap itself. He spent accordingly. Against the caution of the older generation, Procter poured money into advertising, buying space in the national weeklies and religious papers that reached into parlors from Maine to California, printing the pure white bar and its unforgettable number again and again, until ivory was no longer a local product, but a household word in households that had never seen the Ohio River. By 1890, the company that had begun with a single kettle was selling more than 30 kinds of soap, had incorporated to raise capital for its expansion, and could not, from its old works, make ivory fast enough to meet the demand that its own advertising had conjured out of the air. That was a problem of a happy kind, and its solution would give the company something no soap firm had ever possessed. Procter & Gamble was about to build itself a city, but first, on a winter night in 1884, its factory was going to burn. Chapter 5. Ivory Dale. The fire came on the 7th of January, 1884, one of the coldest days of that winter. It broke out in the cramped works on Central Avenue, where the company had made its soap for 40 years, and it ran through the old wooden buildings until nearly all of them were destroyed or badly damaged. Across the street, the John Hawk Brewery threw open its doors so the firemen could come in from the cold and thaw their hands between shifts at the hose. By morning, the birthplace of the company was a black ruin in the snow. It was the best thing that could have happened to Procter & Gamble. The old plant had been too small for years, hemmed in by the streets of a growing city, and the company had been selling ivory faster than it could pour it. The fire settled the question of whether to move. Procter & Gamble bought a stretch of open ground several miles north of downtown, in the Mill Creek Valley near the village of St. Bernard, and set out to build not a replacement, but a monument. To design it, the company hired the most significant industrial architect in the country, a Chicago man named Solon Spencer Beeman. Beeman was not the obvious choice for a soap firm, because he was famous for something far grander and far more troubling. A few years earlier, for the railcar magnate George Pullman, Beeman had designed Pullman, Illinois, the first fully planned company town in America, a place where the men who built Pullman's railcars lived in Pullman's houses, shopped in Pullman's stores, drank Pullman's water, and paid all of it back to Pullman out of the wages Pullman set. It was celebrated at first as the shape of the industrial future. Within a decade, it would become notorious when the workers of that model town, their wages cut but their rents held high, walked off the job in a strike that spread across the nation's railroads and had to be broken in the end by federal troops. That was the man Procter & Gamble brought to Ohio, and the revealing thing is what the company took from him and what it left behind. It took the vision of the total industrial environment, the factory conceived as a single designed and unified world. It did not take the town. Ivorydale, when it rose through the middle and later 1880s, had no company houses, no company store, no fence of ownership drawn around the private lives of the people who worked there. Procter & Gamble would find its own way to bind its workers to it, a way that drew less blood than Pullman's and held them just as fast. But that is the next chapter. First, there was the sheer fact of the place. It was enormous, and it grew more enormous with every passing decade. The first Ivorydale plant covered 11 acres. In time, the complex would spread across 243 acres and fill with 120 separate buildings, among them a food plant that was itself the size of a small factory. It became, and would long remain, one of the largest soap works on the face of the earth. It had its own fire station, its own dining halls, its own recreation grounds, its own web of railroad tracks running between the buildings. A writer sent to describe it in the 1930s could find no romance in it at all, only a maze of utilitarian gray stone buildings, smokestacks, and railroad tracks receding into the smoke. This was no longer a workshop behind a store. It was an industrial city that happened to make soap, and it belonged entirely to one company. And in 1890, in a corner of that city, Procter & Gamble did something quietly more important than all the acreage. It built a laboratory. The analytical lab at Ivorydale, established to study and improve the making of soap, was among the very first industrial research laboratories in the United States. Its significance was easy to miss and hard to overstate. Ivory had come from a single chemist's insight, arrived at once and by hand. The laboratory was a machine for producing such insights on purpose and on schedule. From that point forward, the company would not wait for genius to strike. It would hire genius, house it, and set it to work. The same instinct that had turned a Lucky soap into a national brand was now turned upon invention itself. A city of that size, of course, ran on people, thousands of them, and the 1880s were a dangerous decade in which to employ thousands of people. All across industrial America, workers were organizing, walking out, and fighting the men who owned the factories, sometimes in the streets and sometimes with guns. Pullman's beautiful company town was only a few years from erupting. The men who ran Procter & Gamble faced the oldest problem that power faces, the problem of binding thousands of people to a company and keeping them from ever turning against it. Their answer would look, on its surface, like generosity. Chapter 6. The Velvet Bargain. The man who solved the problem was the founder's grandson. William Cooper Procter, known as Cooper, to tell him apart from the two William Proctors before him, had been called home from the College of New Jersey in 1883, a month short of his degree, because his father wanted him in the business. His father did not put him in an office. He put him on the factory floor, and Cooper spent his first years at Procter & Gamble making soap beside the men whose loyalty he would spend the rest of his life securing. He came to know them, and he came to understand something that the owners of most American factories never troubled to learn, which was what the men wanted and what it would cost to give it to them. He had arrived in the middle of a war. The 1880s were among the most turbulent years in the history of American labor, the decade of the Haymarket bombing, when strikes rolled through American industry one after another, and Procter & Gamble was not spared. The Knights of Labor were organizing its workers. Walkouts came in waves. In 1885, at Cooper's urging, the company did something no American firm had done before and gave its workers Saturday afternoon off with no cut in pay. It was a genuine gift, and it bought almost nothing. Over the next 2 years, there were 14 separate strikes at Procter & Gamble. Cooper drew the correct lesson, which was that a gift changes nothing in how a man sees his employer because it costs him nothing to lose. What was needed was not generosity, but entanglement. In April of 1887, over the objections of a family that thought he had lost his senses, Cooper Procter announced that every employee would from then on receive a share of the company's profits, paid twice a year, in proportion to his wages. On its face, it was one of the most enlightened labor policies in the country, among the first profit-sharing plans any American company had ever offered. Underneath, it was something more precise. A man who owned a slice of the profits could not strike against the company without striking against himself. Cooper never pretended, at least not in private, that this was charity. In his own business diary, he set down the rule that governed all of it, that any worthwhile change in the running of a business must, in his words, first and last, have the element of lessening the cost. The half-holidays and the dividends were not gifts. They were investments, and he expected a return on them. When the first profit-sharing checks went out, and the men took the money gladly but worked no harder for it, Cooper did not abandon the plan. He revised it, tying the payments to performance, adjusting the machine until the loyalty it produced could be counted on a ledger. And he kept building. Over the decades that followed, Procter & Gamble assembled a structure of benefits without equal in American industry, and every new beam of it fastened the worker more firmly to the company. The Saturday half-holiday came in 1885, profit-sharing in 1887, a plan to sell workers' company stock in 1892, sweetened in 1903 so that for every dollar a man put toward shares, the company added 4. Sickness and disability insurance in 1915, the 8-hour day in 1918, and in the early 1920s, the crown of it all, a guarantee that every qualified employee would receive at least 48 weeks of paid work every year, in good times and in bad, a promise almost no other manufacturer in the country dared to make. There was even a seat on the board of directors reserved for an elected representative of the men. The effect was exactly what Cooper had designed. Through the decades when Homestead and Pullman and Ludlow were being written into American memory in blood, when other owners answered their workers with Pinkerton rifles and the state militia, the great soap works at Ivorydale kept its peace. Procter & Gamble had bought what its rivals tried to seize by force, and it had bought it more cheaply because a contented man guards his own contentment. Cooper stated the principle without embarrassment. Any benefit given to the workers, he held, had to rest on the fact that every man returned full value for what he received, or else the whole arrangement was unsound. It was never a gift. It was always a bargain, and the velvet was wrapped around iron. How complete the bargain was can be measured by a single object. When the workers of Ivorydale wished to honor the man whose plans had shaped their working lives, they raised the money themselves and set up a monument to William Cooper Procter on the company grounds. The men who had been so thoroughly bound to the company paid, out of their own wages, to memorialize the man who had bound them, and they did it in gratitude, and by their own lights they were not wrong to. Cooper Procter had proven something that would reach far beyond the soap works. He had shown that human loyalty was not a mystery but a problem, and that a problem could be studied and solved. It was only a matter of time before the company turned that same conviction outward, away from the men who made the soap and toward the women who bought it. In the 1920s, Procter & Gamble would send a man with a clipboard into the kitchens of America. Chapter 7. Studying the Housewife. For nearly 90 years, Procter & Gamble had studied soap. It knew soap the way few firms on earth knew anything, its chemistry, its manufacture, its cost to the fraction of a cent. What it did not know, in any organized way, was the people who bought the soap. That began to change in the 1920s, and the man who changed it was an economist named Paul Smeltzer. Smeltzer, called Doc for the doctorate in economics he had taken at Johns Hopkins, had been hired to study commodity prices, the cost of the fats and oils the company bought by the shipload. He was a small, precise, insistent man whose neat sporting jackets stood out among the dark suits of the Cincinnati executives, and he had a habit that unsettled them. He asked questions they could not answer. At a meeting in the president's office, with William Cooper Procter himself in the room, the talk turned to ivory, and Smeltzer asked how much of the company's most famous soap Americans used to wash their hands and faces, and how much they used to wash their dishes and their clothes. It was a simple question about the company's own flagship product, and no one in the room had the faintest idea. Procter looked at him and said, "Maybe you should go find out." Smeltzer went and found out, and the way he found out was new. He sent researchers, many of them women, out of the office and into the houses of ordinary Americans to knock on doors and sit in kitchens and ask the woman of the house how she washed and what she washed with and why, and then to watch her do it. No large company had ever set out to do such a thing in an organized way. In 1924, out of this work, Procter & Gamble built one of the first market research departments in the United States and put Doc Smeltzer in charge of it. What it produced was a portrait of the American home in numbers. The company learned, for the first time, exactly what its soap was for. By the company's own count, 40% of the ivory sold in America was used for bathing, 31% for the hands and face, and 12% for washing the dishes. It learned which women bought which products and sorted them by income and neighborhood and background into types that could be counted and predicted. Facts that the housewife herself had never put into words, had never even thought to think, were now written down in a ledger in Cincinnati. The woman at the kitchen sink had become a data set. This was a quieter revolution than the laboratory or the factory city, and a deeper one. For most of industrial history, a company had made a thing and hoped that people would want it. Smeltzer inverted the order. Now the company would first discover what people wanted, in the most private rooms of their houses, and only then decide what to make and how to sell it. The same instinct that Cooper Procter had turned upon his workers, the conviction that human behavior was not a mystery but a problem to be studied and solved, had been turned now upon the customer, and the customer did not know it. She reached for the soap on the shelf. She never saw that the company had reached into her home first and was watching her hand. Knowing what people wanted, however, was only half of a machine. Knowledge sitting in Smeltzer's ledgers changed nothing by itself. Someone inside the company had to own the task of turning that knowledge into wanting, of taking a bar of soap all but indistinguishable from a dozen others and making the American public desire that one by name. As the company was organized, nobody's job was to do that. And in 1931, a young man in the advertising department, frustrated that no one was responsible for the fate of the brands he worked on, sat down to write a memo about it. The memo ran 3 pages. It would reorganize Procter & Gamble, and in time, a great part of the corporate world, around a single new idea. Chapter 8. The Brand Men. The young man who wrote the memo was named Neil McElroy. He had come to Procter & Gamble in 1925, straight out of Harvard, and by 1931 he was still short of 30, running the advertising for a soap called Camay. Camay was a perfumed beauty bar the company had brought out in 1926, and McElroy had been handed an impossible assignment. His soap was expected to fight for shelf space against the perfumed soaps of Lever and Palmolive, which was fair enough. but it was also expected to fight against Ivory, Procter & Gamble's own flagship, which soaked up nearly all of the company's money and attention. McElroy was managing a brand that the company had, in effect, set up to lose to its own house. On the 13th of May, 1931, he sat down and wrote a memorandum about the problem, and in doing so he broke a company rule. President Richard Dupree was known for insisting that no memo run longer than a single page. McElroy's ran to 3 pages and fewer than 800 words. On its surface, it was a modest thing, a request to hire 2 more people. Underneath, it proposed to turn the company inside out. Every brand, McElroy argued, should have its own man, and under him a dedicated team, an assistant, and a set of field people whose entire working life was that one brand and nothing else. This person would own the brand completely, its advertising, its packaging, its pricing, its performance territory by territory across the country. He would take, in McElroy's own phrase, a very heavy share of individual brand responsibility. Each brand would be run as though it were a separate business with its own budget and its own future, and if that meant one Procter & Gamble soap competing directly against another Procter & Gamble soap, so much the better. The point was that somewhere in the company, one human being would be wholly accountable for the single bar sitting on the shelf and would stand, in effect, at the customer's elbow. Dupree read the 3 pages and approved them. It was one of the most consequential decisions in the history of American business, and almost no one noticed it at the time. What McElroy had invented, in a memo written to justify 2 hires, was brand management, and brand management would spread outward from Cincinnati until it became the way the modern corporation organized itself. Consumer companies across the country, and then across the world, remade themselves in its image. 3/4 of a century later, the advertising industry would look back across its entire history and name that small memo the single most important thing that had ever happened to it. What McElroy had actually done was to finish a machine. Doc Smelser had learned how to find out what people wanted. The brand man was the one who would turn that knowledge into wanting, brand by brand, and drive a chosen product into the customer's hands. And the logic of the system pushed the company always toward more brands and toward setting its brands against one another, until a woman standing before a shelf of soaps and choosing, as she believed, freely among rival products, was in truth very often choosing among the children of a single company in Cincinnati, each of them tended by a professional in an office whose whole purpose was her preference. The choice was real to her. It had been arranged for her. A brand man, though, could only reach into the home through whatever windows already stood open, and in 1931, a new one had just been thrown wide in nearly every parlor in the country. It ran on electricity, it sat in the corner of the room like a member of the family, and it talked from morning until night. Procter & Gamble was about to discover radio and to invent, in order to carry its brands across that threshold and into the American home, an entirely new kind of story. Chapter 9. The Soap Opera. Procter & Gamble had been on the radio since the 1920s, but at first it used the new medium the way it used a newspaper, to instruct. In 1923 it put a program called Crisco Cooking Talks on the air, in which recipes were read aloud to housewives. These were useful and forgettable. Then, around 1930, someone at the company asked a different question, which was whether the radio might be used not to instruct the woman at home, but to keep her company and to hold her day after day inside a story. The company began to experiment quietly on its own station in Cincinnati, and in 1933 it found what it was looking for. Her name was Ma Perkins. She was a widow who ran a sawmill in a small town and handed out plain wisdom to her grown children in their troubles, 15 minutes a day, 5 days a week. She was warm and homely and beloved, and she was paid for entirely by a single Procter & Gamble laundry soap, so that the program went out over the air under a title that left nothing to the imagination. It was called Oxydol's Own Ma Perkins. The drama and the detergent shared a name because the drama existed to sell the detergent, and no one involved pretended otherwise. What made the form so effective was that it was engineered, as carefully as any soap, to fit the woman it was meant for. The pioneer of the craft was a Dayton schoolteacher named Irna Phillips, who had built the first of these serials in 1930 and understood her audience precisely. She wrote her episodes to move slowly, deliberately slowly, so that a woman scrubbing a floor or minding a stove could follow every turn without setting down her work. She marked each change of scene with a swell of organ music so the listener's hands could stay busy while her ear was told what to feel. And she ended each episode in the middle of a crisis, on a question left hanging, so that the woman at home would have to come back the next afternoon to learn how it turned out. Everything about the shape of the thing had been fitted to the daily life that Doc Smelser's researchers had gone into the kitchens to measure. Other hands multiplied it. A husband and wife team named Ann and Frank Hummert ran what amounted to a factory for these serials, turning them out by the dozen, stocked with amnesia and blackmail and long-lost husbands and slow, fatal diseases. The name the genre finally took was an insult, and it came from the money. The trade press, watching grown women weep over these overwrought little melodramas paid for by detergent companies, began to call them soap operas, the soap for the sponsors and the opera for the heaving emotion, the way a cheap Western was a horse opera. The press department at NBC helped spread the phrase in 1938. It was meant to belittle, but it captured something true, which was that the most intimate form of storytelling in American life had been named, correctly, after a bar of soap. The scale of what Procter & Gamble built this way is easily lost now. By 1940, some 64 of these serials filled nearly all of the sponsored daytime hours on network radio. Across the era, more than 180 of them were made. They reached an audience of roughly 40 million listeners in a country where the number of homes with a radio had climbed from 12 million at the start of the 1930s to more than 28 million by the end of it. Procter & Gamble was the largest single programmer among them, running an entire daily lineup across the networks, one show handing off to the next straight through the afternoon. Ma Perkins alone would run for 27 years. Without ever quite announcing it, and while still thinking of itself as a soap company, Procter & Gamble had become one of the largest producers of entertainment in the United States. And the point of all of it, always, was the soap. The stories were the vehicle. Millions of American women arranged their afternoons, and no small part of their inner lives, around families that did not exist, whose purpose was to hold an audience in place between advertisements. The feeling the women brought to it was real. Their loyalty was real. The apparatus underneath it was a machine for selling detergent, and it was the deepest reach into the home the company had yet achieved, deeper than the researcher at the door or the notice in the magazine, a voice in the corner of the parlor every single day that a woman came to love and that loved Oxydol back. The strangest thing the machine produced, it produced almost by accident. One of Irna Phillips's creations, a serial called The Guiding Light, went on the air in 1937 to sell a Procter & Gamble soap. It moved from radio to television, and it kept going, And it did not stop until 2009, 72 years later, by which time it was the longest continuous story ever told by human beings. A company that had set out to move more detergent had, somewhere along the way, authored the longest narrative in the history of the world. The men who ran such a company were something other than soap makers now, and one of them, the young author of the Brand Man Memo, was about to rise so high that the habits of mind he had learned selling Oxydol would follow him all the way into the Pentagon. Chapter 10. How Far the Logic Traveled. Neil McElroy had come to Procter & Gamble in 1925 by opening envelopes. His first job, taken the summer after Harvard while he waited to begin business school, was in the company mailroom, sorting the post for something near $100 a month. He never left for business school. He moved into soap sales, then into the promotions department, and by 1929 he was running it, and 2 years after that he wrote the memo that remade the company. In 1948 he became president of Procter & Gamble. It was a straight line drawn from the mail sacks to the top office, and it was only the first half of the distance he would travel. The idea he had set down in 1931 traveled even further than the man. Brand management became the way Procter & Gamble chose its own leaders, so that every president who followed came up through the brands. Then it spread beyond Cincinnati altogether. In his later years, McElroy advised Stanford University, and by several accounts it was there that his thinking reached two young engineers named Bill Hewlett and David Packard, who folded the brand man idea into the management philosophy that built Hewlett-Packard and, through it, a great part of Silicon Valley. The discipline that runs the technology industry today, the product manager who sits close to the customer and owns a product end-to-end, is the direct descendant of a memo written to sell more Camay. The logic of the soap aisle became the logic of the microchip, and then the man himself left soap behind in the most startling way imaginable. In October of 1957, President Eisenhower made Neil McElroy, a soap executive with almost no experience of government, the Secretary of Defense of the United States. He was sworn in on the 9th of October, 5 days after the Soviet Union had put the first satellite, Sputnik, into orbit and frightened the nation into believing it was losing the race for the sky. The man who had spent his life learning what American women wanted in a laundry soap now sat atop the largest military establishment on Earth, at the opening of the age of the missile. He described his job, the day he was sworn in, as being that of captain of President Eisenhower's defense team, the language of a man accustomed to running an operation rather than commanding an army. He did not panic, which was itself a kind of achievement in that autumn. He judged that Sputnik had shifted the world's opinion more than its balance of power, and he set about ordering American rockets into production, the Thor and the Jupiter, the Atlas and the Titan, the Navy's Polaris, and, in the coming year, the Minuteman in its underground silo. But the most consequential thing he did in his 2 years at the Pentagon had nothing to do with any single weapon. On the 7th of February 1958, McElroy established a small and peculiar new agency, one with almost no laboratories of its own and a mandate to reach past the near future and fund the strangest and most advanced research it could find. He called it the Advanced Research Projects Agency. In time, out of that agency, would come the computer network that became the Internet. It is worth stopping to trace the line because it is nearly impossible to believe. A man learned his trade by finding out what housewives wanted in a bar of soap and building a company to give it to them. He carried the same cast of mind into the service of the state and set in motion the agency whose network the modern world now runs on. The instinct that Procter & Gamble had refined to manufacture the desire for detergent turned out to belong to no single product and no single industry. It could organize a corporation or a defense department or, in the right hands, an entire century. There had never been anything about it that belonged only to soap. While McElroy was in Washington, the machine he had helped build was back in Cincinnati doing the thing it did best, in the richest market for household goods that had ever existed. The war was over, America was buying, and Procter & Gamble was about to fill every room of the American house with a product bearing one of its names, beginning with a blue and orange box that would change the way the whole country washed its clothes. Chapter 11. Saturation. The blue and orange box was called Tide, and it came out in 1946, and it was not soap. It was the first heavy-duty synthetic detergent made for the American home, built in the laboratory out of chemistry rather than rendered fat, and it cleaned better than anything the company had ever sold while costing less. Housewives took to it at once. Within 4 years, Tide was the best-selling laundry product in the United States, and the company that had built its name and its fortune on soap now led the market with something that was not soap at all. It was a fitting way to open the richest chapter in the company's history, because the years after the war were the greatest market for household goods the world had ever seen, and Procter & Gamble meant to own it room by room. The products came out in a steady march. Prell shampoo in 1947, Joy, the first liquid dish detergent, in 1949. Then, in 1955, after years of research alongside scientists at Indiana University, Crest, the first toothpaste with fluoride, a paste that genuinely reduced the decay of teeth. Crest was a different kind of triumph because, with it, the company found a way to enlist science itself into the sale. In 1960, the American Dental Association did something it had never done for any commercial toothpaste and formally endorsed Crest as effective against cavities. That single sentence of professional blessing carried Crest past Colgate to the top of the market within 2 years. Procter & Gamble had learned to make even the dentist an ally in the selling, and it kept coming. The company bought the Charmin paper mills in 1957 and moved into the bathroom with toilet tissue and, before long, paper towels under the name Bounty. It brought out Downy to soften the laundry in 1960. And in 1961, a company engineer named Victor Mills, who had grown tired of changing his infant grandchild's cloth diapers, gave Procter & Gamble the product that would carry it into the last unconquered room of the house. Pampers, the first successful disposable diaper, created a market that had not existed before and set the company down at the side of the crib. That same year, it brought out Head & Shoulders for the hair. The rooms of the American home were filling up one by one with the goods of a single firm in Cincinnati. By the middle of the 1960s, the conquest was complete, and it can be walked through like a house. In the laundry stood Tide and Downy. At the kitchen sink, Joy. In the bathroom, Crest on the shelf and Ivory or Camay at the basin, Prell and Head & Shoulders in the shower, Charmin and Bounty on their rolls. In the nursery, Pampers. In the pantry, Crisco and Folgers coffee and Duncan Hines cakes. And in the living room, on the television set that now stood where the radio had stood, played the company's own daytime dramas, paid for by the very products stacked in all the other rooms. Procter & Gamble had become the largest advertiser in the United States, a place it would hold for generations, which is to say it had become the single loudest commercial voice speaking to the American family. The company was no longer a thing that Americans bought from. It had become a thing they lived inside. This was the summit. From a wooden kettle behind a store in Porkopolis, In a little more than a century, the company had achieved what no maker of soap could ever have dreamed, a near-total presence in the American home, and with it something more valuable than any single brand. It had won the country's trust. An American reaching for a Procter & Gamble product did not stop to wonder whether it was safe. Safety was assumed because the company's goods had always been safe, and because the same name was already sitting in every other room of the house. That assumption was the most valuable thing Procter & Gamble owned. It was also, though not one person in the company could have seen it in those confident years, the exact mechanism of the catastrophe ahead. A company trusted so completely is a company whose next product will not be questioned. And at the very height of that confidence, in the last years of the 1970s, Procter & Gamble was preparing to place inside the bodies of millions of American women a new product engineered in its laboratories to absorb more than anything of its kind had ever absorbed before, and advertised, without a trace of irony, as the one that even absorbed the worry. Chapter 12. Rely. The product was called Rely, and it was a tampon, and it belonged to the one room of the American household that Procter & Gamble had not yet conquered. The market for tampons belonged to Tampax and a few others. It was large, and the company that had learned to sell a nation its soap and its toothpaste and its diapers saw no reason it should not sell the nation this as well. So it built something new, and it built it the way it built everything, in the laboratory to a specification, and then it turned the whole machine loose upon the selling of it. What made Rely different was that it was not made of cotton or rayon, as every tampon before it had been. It was synthetic. Inside a small polyester pouch sat compressed beads of polyester foam and a quantity of carboxymethylcellulose, a thickening agent so ordinary that it was used to stiffen the texture of processed food. On contact with fluid, the compound swelled into a gel, and the whole device opened into a cup that shaped itself to the body and could take up nearly 20 times its own weight. It absorbed far more than any tampon had ever absorbed, and it could be worn far longer, and that was precisely the promise the company sold. Absorb more, change less. They named it Rely, which is to say they named it after the act of trust, and they advertised it with a line that the rest of this story has been walking toward. Rely, the commercials said, even absorbs the worry. Most of them closed on a second line, gentle and confident. Remember, they named it Rely. There was one more thing about Rely, and it belonged not to chemistry, but to timing. The product had first been tested in the towns of Rochester and Fort Wayne in 1974. 2 years later, in 1976, the federal government changed its laws and began to treat tampons and similar products as medical devices, the sort of thing that had to be tested rigorously and cleared by the Food and Drug Administration before it could be sold. But Rely had been born just ahead of that line. Under a clause that grandfathered in what already existed, Procter & Gamble was never required to prove to the government that the synthetic device it was asking women to wear inside their bodies for hours at a time was safe. Rely entered the American market through a gap in the calendar. Then the machine went to work. Beginning in 1975 and rising to a flood as the decade closed, Procter & Gamble mailed free samples of Rely to American women in wave after wave, by one accounting as many as 45 million of them, delivered to the door the way Ivory and Tide and Pampers had been delivered, and trusted on the same trust. The company was doing only what it had always done, and done better than anyone alive. It was placing its product into the American home and asking the home to believe in it, and the home did. And here, two stories that had been moving separately began to close on one another. In 1978, in the same stretch of years when Procter & Gamble's researchers were finishing the design of Rely and readying it for the country, physicians in Colorado were putting a name to a strange and savage illness they had lately begun to see, an illness that a common and usually harmless bacterium could produce, that struck without warning and could kill a healthy young person within days. They called it toxic shock syndrome. Neither the doctors naming the disease nor the company perfecting the product yet understood that the two had anything to do with each other. They were about to. And the place where they would meet was the bodies of American women. Chapter 13. Toxic Shock. The first warning came in January 1980 from the upper Midwest. Epidemiologists in Wisconsin and Minnesota, among them a Wisconsin state physician named Jeffrey Davis, had begun to notice something they could not explain, a cluster of cases of a rare and violent illness, and they noticed that it was striking, again and again, young women who were menstruating. They reported what they were seeing to the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta. In the samples taken from the sick, one organism kept appearing, a common bacterium called Staphylococcus aureus, a germ that lives harmlessly on the skin of a great many people. The illness it produced in these women was anything but harmless. Under certain conditions, the bacterium generated a toxin, and when that toxin reached the bloodstream, the body turned against itself with sudden high fever, a collapse of blood pressure, and the failure of one organ after another. It could move with terrible speed. Women who had been entirely well fell gravely ill within hours, and some of them, despite everything the hospitals could do, were dead within days. What made it so hard to take in was the ordinariness of the victims and the ordinariness of the cause. These were not the frail or the old, they were young women, and the thing that was killing them had to do with menstruation. Through the spring and summer of 1980, as a task force at the CDC took up the investigation, the number of reported cases climbed. The task force ran two studies. The first established that the illness was linked to the use of tampons. The second, completed in September, went further and found that it was linked above all to one tampon in particular. Among the women who had fallen ill and were examined in that second study, roughly 7 in 10 had used Rely, against only about a quarter of the healthy women they were compared with. Of all the tampons on the American market, the CDC concluded, Rely was the single brand most associated with the disease. The reason lay in the very thing the company had engineered and advertised, the quality that made Rely remarkable, its enormous absorbency, and the design that let a woman leave one in place for many hours, was the quality that made it dangerous. The synthetic material, worn long inside the body, created exactly the warm and fluid-rich conditions in which the bacterium multiplied and its toxin formed. The selling point was the hazard. For the first time in nearly a century and a half of finding out what people wanted and giving it to them, Procter & Gamble had manufactured a desire whose satisfaction could kill the woman who felt it. Rely was not the only culprit, and honesty requires that this be said plainly. Its very success had set off a competition in which the other makers of tampons raced to match its absorbency, so that the danger had spread across an entire category that Rely had led the industry into. But Rely was the worst of them. It was the brand the evidence pointed to over and over, the one whose users fell ill far out of proportion to their number. The cost can be stated, though it should not be stated coldly. By the end of 1980, the CDC had recorded more than 800 cases of menstrual toxic shock in the United States, and at least 38 women had died of it, and the true figures were almost certainly higher than the ones that reached Atlanta. To the company, these could be counted. To the families, they could not. Each of the dead was a particular young woman who had reached for a particular product on a shelf, or pulled it from a sample box that had arrived in the mail and had trusted it, because the name on it was a name that had been in her family's home her whole life. By that September, the evidence had become impossible to set aside. The question was no longer whether Rely was implicated in the deaths. The question was what Procter & Gamble would do about it, and how quickly, and beneath that a harder question still, of what the company had known, and when it had known it, before the CDC dragged the matter into the light. The first of those questions was answered on the 22nd of September, 1980. The others would have to wait for a courtroom. Chapter 14. The Recall. On the 22nd of September 1980, 16 days after Patricia Kemp died, Procter & Gamble withdrew Rely from the market. It did so voluntarily, entering into a consent agreement with the Food and Drug Administration to notify the public and retrieve the product from the shelves, and it spent heavily to do it, running advertisements that told American women to stop using a product the company had spent nearly 20 years and a great deal of money to create. In fairness to the company, once the CDC's September study reached it, the recall came quickly, within a week or so, and the number of toxic shock cases fell sharply afterward. But Procter & Gamble did not concede, then or later, that Rely had caused the disease. It pulled the product while denying that the product was to blame. The recall did not end the matter. It only moved it. The families of the women who had died or been gravely harmed began to sue, and the suits multiplied, some 400 of them within 2 years, and nearly 900 by the end of the decade. Most were settled quietly, out of court and out of the public eye. A handful went to trial, and the one that came to stand for all of them was heard in a federal courtroom in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in the spring of 1982. Its subject was Patricia Kemp. She had begun using Rely on the 2nd of September 1980. She felt the first symptoms the following day. She was dead on the 6th, 4 days after she started, at the age of 25, leaving a husband and children. Michael Kemp sued the company, and for 2 weeks the jury heard the case that the rest of the country's suits would rise or fall on. The two sides told two different stories. The Kemp's attorney, a Cedar Rapids lawyer named Tom Riley, argued that Rely had been a defective product, one that a microbiologist testifying for the family called a toxin factory, a device that gave the bacterium both a place to breed and the material to feed on. And he argued something graver, that a member of the CDC task force had told the company of the link between tampons and toxic shock in June of 1980, 3 months before Mrs. Kemp died, and that Procter & Gamble had balked at pulling the product and had failed to warn the women who used it. The company answered that the science of that year had been genuinely uncertain, that no one had yet proven what caused the disease, that it had learned of the specific study implicating Rely only in the middle of September, and had acted within days, and it went so far as to question whether Patricia Kemp had died of toxic shock at all. On the 21st of April, 1982, the jury reached a verdict that split the difference in a way that has held up as roughly just. It found that Rely had been defective and that Procter & Gamble had been negligent, and it awarded Michael Kemp $300,000. But it refused to award punitive damages, and an appeals court later agreed with that refusal, holding that in the real scientific fog of 1980, the company's conduct, whatever else it was, could not fairly be called reckless. The finding was careful. A defective product and a negligent maker, but not a wicked one. The arithmetic underneath the verdict is worth sitting with for a moment. Michael Kemp had first asked for $30 million for the life of a wife who had died at 25. The jury set the value of that life at $300,000. And in the same period, to cover the entire Rely affair, the recall and the lawsuits together, Procter & Gamble quietly set aside a reserve that a court would later reveal to have been $150 million before taxes. The company could have absorbed 500 Patricia Kames and scarcely felt it in the ledger. That is the hard fact at the center of this story, and it is not a satisfying one. Rely was a catastrophe, and Rely was, to Procter & Gamble, very nearly a rounding error. The company wrote off the product, paid the settlements, absorbed the blow, and went on selling Tide and Crest and Charmine and Pampers into every home in America without breaking stride. The empire that had killed did not fall. It did not so much as stumble. And in those very years, while its lawyers were quietly settling the tampon suits one after another, Procter & Gamble found itself under an attack of a wholly different kind, one that had nothing to do with chemistry or safety and everything to do with the little emblem its dock hands had scratched onto a shipping crate 130 years before. Across the country, millions of Americans had begun to whisper that the men who made their soap were servants of Satan. Chapter 15. The Devil in the Moon. While Procter & Gamble was quietly settling the Rely suits, it found itself fighting for its reputation on a front where none of its weapons worked. Beginning around 1980, in the very same years, a rumor took hold across the United States. It held that Procter & Gamble, the maker of the nation's soap, was an instrument of the devil. It arose out of a particular moment. The late 1970s and 1980s were the years of what came to be called the Satanic Panic, a wave of fear that hidden cults of devil worshippers were at work in American life, in daycare centers and heavy metal records, and, it now seemed, in the laundry aisle. The panic found in Procter & Gamble a perfect object because the company wore an old and eccentric symbol that could be made to mean whatever a frightened eye wished it to mean. The bearded man in the moon and his 13 stars, the emblem the dockhands had scratched onto a crate 130 years earlier so that people who could not read would know the goods were trustworthy, was now studied for evil. The curls of the moon man's beard, people said, formed 3 sixes. The stars, joined with a pencil, spelled out 666, the number of the beast from the book of Revelation. Some saw horns. At the center of the rumor was a confession that never took place, on leaflets passed hand to hand, and from pulpits and in whispered retellings, the story ran that the president of Procter & Gamble had gone on national television, on the Phil Donahue Show, or Merv Griffin, or Sally, the details shifting with each telling, and had calmly admitted that the company gave a share of its profits to the Church of Satan. Asked whether such an admission might hurt his business, he was said to have replied that there were not enough Christians in the United States to make a difference. None of it had happened. No executive of the company had ever appeared on any such program or said any such thing, a fact the programs themselves confirmed, and the identical hoax was told in the same years about the clothing designer Liz Claiborne. But a rumor asks for no evidence, and a confession that was never made cannot be disproven because there is nothing there to disprove. It spread through exactly the channels that carry American belief. It went out on church leaflets and from the pulpits of televangelists with enormous followings, and by the oldest engine of all, one neighbor telling another. Traveling preachers who warned against rock music would put the Procter & Gamble emblem up on a slide beside the pentagram. The company was buried under the response. In June and July of 1982, alone, it received some 15,000 calls and letters about its supposed pact with the devil. It opened telephone lines to answer them. It sued the people it could identify as sources, among them, at one point, an Atlanta television weatherman. And here lay the deep and bitter irony of the whole affair, the thing that makes it belong to this story and not merely to the history of American rumor. Procter & Gamble was the greatest manufacturer of belief the country had ever produced. It had built the machinery that told America what to think about a bar of soap. It had invented the brand and the soap opera and mastered the grassroots and the airwaves alike. And now a belief it had not made, and could not unmake, was loose in precisely those channels, and against it the company was helpless. All its research, all its advertising, all its long command of the American mind could not kill a rumor. The maker of belief had met a belief it could not govern. In April of 1985, worn down, the company did the only thing that seemed to remain and began to strip the moon and stars from its products. It made everything worse. To those who believed, a company removing a satanic mark was a company admitting the mark had been satanic all along. The little emblem, drawn to be trusted, had become so poisonous that its owner had to disown it, and the disowning was taken as a confession. The rumor would not die. It ran in one mutation after another for a quarter of a century. Over time, the company grew convinced that much of it was being pushed along by distributors for Amway, a rival in the same household aisles, and it went to court to prove it. Finally, in 2007, a federal jury in Salt Lake City found that 4 Amway distributors had spread the lie to damage a competitor and ordered them to pay Procter & Gamble more than $19 million. 27 years after the whispering began, the company had, in the narrow terms of the law, won. But a rumor is never truly defeated, and the company knew it. It had survived the devil the way it had survived Rely, not by being cleared in the minds of those who believed, but by outlasting the damage, absorbing it, and going on selling. And some years later, around 2013, in a small and telling gesture, Procter & Gamble allowed a faint sliver of a moon to return to the edge of its corporate mark, as though enough time had passed that the old emblem might at last be forgiven. It is worth pausing on what that pattern means. An empire had killed its own customers and been accused of serving Satan, and had walked through both without falling. Whatever it is that brings such an institution down, neither of these had been it. Chapter 16. Still in the Cabinet. Nearly 2 centuries have passed since 2 immigrant tradesmen pooled $7,000 behind a store in a city that smelled of slaughtered hogs. The company they founded is still there. It has never left Cincinnati, and it operates today out of a tower called One Procter & Gamble Plaza. And by any measure that can be applied to a business, it has won. The figures are worth stating plainly, because they are the present tense of everything this story has described. Procter & Gamble sells more than $84 billion of goods a year. It employs roughly 109,000 people and sells its products in more than 180 countries. It carries some 65 brands, more than 20 of which each bring in over $1 billion a year on their own. It is worth, on the stock exchange, over $300 billion, which places it among the most valuable companies on the face of the earth. And it has paid its shareholders a dividend every single year since 1890, without a break, for 135 years running, through 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Rely recall, and the long accusation of the devil. But here is the thing that sets this empire apart from every other one in the chronicle of American power: the oil trusts and the rail fortunes and the mining dynasties. There is no Procter at the head of it, and no Gamble. The families faded from control generations ago. and no descendant runs the company that bears their names. It is owned by no one and by everyone, by millions of anonymous shareholders, and it is run by professional managers who rose, every last one of them, through the system of brand management that a young man invented in a 3-page memo in 1931. What survives in Cincinnati is not a dynasty. It is a machine, and the machine has outlived the men who built it, exactly as it was designed to. The house can be walked through one more time. In the laundry room, Tide. On the bathroom shelf, Crest. In the nursery, Pampers. On their rolls, Charmin and Bounty. They are the same names, in the same rooms, that were there in 1980 when a young woman reached into a sample box that had come in the mail. The same names that were on the products people were being warned, from pulpits to cast out of their homes. They were there through all of it, and they are there tonight, in tens of millions of American houses, as ordinary and unremarked as the walls. And they are there for the reason they have always been there. Not because they are loved or chosen or even noticed, but because they are simply assumed. Long ago, the company wove itself so far down into the ordinary texture of daily life that it disappeared from view, and to disappear from view is the safest thing an institution can do. The same trust that made Rely lethal is the trust that keeps every other product in the cabinet, unquestioned, reached for without a thought. A century ago, the company set out to learn what people wanted, and to make them want it by name. And it succeeded so completely that the wanting became invisible, a reflex, a habit passed down through generations who no longer remember learning it. That is where the story of Procter Gamble parts from the others this channel has told. The oil trust was broken into pieces. The railroad barons overreached and collapsed. The mining towns emptied out, and their grand houses fell to ruin. And the empires of acres became the ghost towns that acres so often become. But the soap company did not fall. It killed, and it was accused of serving Satan, and it walked through every reckoning that came for it. And it stands today not as a ruin, but as a going concern, larger than it has ever been, and it will in all likelihood outlast everyone now drawing breath. An empire of land can empty. An empire built inside the home does not, because no one ever moves out. Somewhere tonight, on a box or a bottle on a shelf, if the light falls across it a certain way, there is a small worn crescent and a scatter of stars. A man in the moon, the mark that a dockhand once drew on a crate so that people who could not read would know that the thing inside could be trusted. After everything, it is still there. It was always going to be.